So today, before we start chapter 2, we're going to go over the homework. So we're going to start with question 9 from chapter 1. And that's on page 62.
10.
10. I just wanted to see if you guys are paying attention. Mary, you guys are here. We'll come back to that. All right, so let's go over exercise 1.9, which talks about the definition of key cost terms: variable cost, fixed cost, prime cost, conversion cost, sunk cost. And remember we talked in the last class about the difference between period cost and product cost. Who remembers the difference? What's the difference between period cost and product cost? Anybody? Okay, Mary?
Period's expense during the period is actually used, like insurance and, for instance, rambling here. Anything to do with the product that you make.
So costs associated with making the product, right. So product costs, we said importantly, are what we call inventoriable costs. Inventoriable costs, inventoriable costs are costs that we actually record as an asset at the time that we're purchasing them. Remember, for example, we said if we purchase raw materials, if we purchase plastic, for example, we debit raw materials because it's an asset, and we credit either cash or accounts payable. That's different, as Mary is saying. For example, if we get an electric bill for operating a manufacturing facility, what is it? What do you think? What happens if we get an electric bill? We might get two electric bills. We might get one electric bill for the manufacturing facility, and we might get one electric bill for the corporate headquarters. Remember we said there's a difference. We have to make a distinction. There's a difference between the janitors that clean the manufacturing facility and the janitors that clean the corporate headquarters. So, go ahead, what on
The
that?
corporate would be the period cost, and for the factory would be the overhead cost.
Right, so it would be a product cost that we really can't trace back to a particular product. We can't trace it back to product A or product B or product C, so it's going to be classified as a manufacturing overhead. So we're not forgetting about it. It's just that we got to make sure that we make a distinction between those costs that are specifically related to manufacturing the product and those costs that are associated with running the entire operation. Now remember, manufacturing costs we describe as product costs. Non-manufacturing costs we refer to as period costs. And the period costs, we said, we show on the income statement as SG&A, selling, general, and administrative. So we're not going to ignore those costs. It's still very important. It's just, remember we said last time, it's about how we classify these different costs, how we group them together. So we're interested in grouping together the selling, general, and administrative costs, which are the non-manufacturing costs. And we looked last time and saw that that's a line on the income statement. And then the product cost actually shows up as cost of goods sold on the income statement. But we said with product costs, because we call them inventoriable costs, we don't recognize them until the time that the products are actually sold. So that's an important distinction. So let's go through some of the questions here in exercise 9 to see if we have a good understanding of this. So the first question says, Lake Company produces a popular tote bag, right? Probably Louis Vuitton or something like that. Is that considered to be popular? Or Gucci, right? Or Dallas, right? Gucci is good. The cloth used to manufacture the tote bag is direct materials, and for financial accounting purposes is classified as blank. Product cost, right? So the direct materials, this cloth that they use to manufacture the tote bag, is classified as a product cost. In terms of cost behavior, the cloth could be also described as, we said, remember there's a difference between fixed cost and variable cost? So the material is a variable cost. Why? Why is it a variable cost? Go ahead, Mackenzie.
Based on the number of bags you produce, the amount of cloth is going to vary from batch to batch, from period to period, right?
The quantity.
Right, quantity.
Right, so the total variable cost is going to vary based on the production quantity. So it's not fixed. The more bags that we make, that we're going to sell to Nordstrom's and Neiman Marcus and Saks Fifth Avenue, the more bags that we make, the more cloth that we're going to use. So our total variable costs are going to increase with production. If that weren't the case, then it would be a fixed cost. Fixed costs are costs that don't vary with production. So what would be an example of a fixed cost? Go ahead. Mackenzie, go ahead. Oh, go ahead.
Rent.
Rent.
Insurance.
Insurance. Now remember, when we talk about fixed costs, also keep in mind that it's got to be within a relevant range. And what does that mean? That means that, true, the cost is fixed. That means it's not going to vary whether you make 1 unit or 1 million units or 10 million units or 100 million units. But there may be a point, if you make more than 100 million units, that what we once considered to be a fixed cost might actually increase. Like, to your point, you said insurance, right? Well, what about if you're making more than 100 million units, maybe the insurance company is going to view that risk a little bit differently now. So, that's what we mean when we say a relevant range. So of course, 5 million units, 10 million units, 50 million, even 100 million units, the costs are fixed. So for all intents and purposes, we can say the costs are fixed, but there could be a point beyond that certain relevant range where the costs might start to vary. So the next scenario for number 9 says the direct labor costs required to produce the tote bags. So direct labor, first we looked at direct materials, but now we're talking about direct labor, combined with manufacturing overhead cost is called what? Conversion cost. Remember we said the manufacturing cost consists of direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. And then we said that direct labor and manufacturing overhead together gets a special classification. That's known as conversion cost. So in other words, how much is it going to cost to convert the raw materials into work in progress or finished goods? So that's important to make that distinction. That's why we look at the conversion cost. The next part of that question says, hi Melissa.
Hello.
Says the company could have taken the funds that it has invested in production equipment and invest them in interest-bearing securities instead. The interest foregone on the securities is what? What type of cost is that?
Opportunity.
It's an opportunity cost. Do you see why? So it says that if we didn't use that money to purchase the equipment that's going to make the tote bags, they could have been earning interest. They could have been, they could have purchased either government bonds or bonds of a corporation. So that's an opportunity cost. That's why we're concerned about how much cash we're tying up in the business, in inventory, for example. So we care how much finished good inventory we have, how much work in process inventory we have, how much money we have tied up in raw materials. Because the cost of capital is not free. So we might have had to borrow $50 million from Chase to purchase the materials, to purchase the plastic. So if we're borrowing $50 million from Chase to purchase materials, we're going to have to pay them interest. Well, even if we had the $50 million, $50 million or 50 million lira, it's about the same, give or take $40 million, but depending on the exchange rate. And you know, at one time the exchange rate for dollars and lira used to be for every $1 was like 1,500,000 lira. Does everybody know what the lira is? That's the currency that's used in Turkey. So that's, in this case, we're talking about an opportunity cost. The cost that's foregone, right? The opportunity that's foregone. So in this particular case, we forego the opportunity to earn interest. And instead, what do? We purchase this manufacturing equipment. All right, so let's look at number 4. This is for exercise 9. Right, so we're looking at the definition of cost terms. Taken together, direct materials cost and direct labor cost required to produce tote bags is called Right, so prime cost is the combination of direct materials and direct labor. Number 5 says, formerly the company produced a smaller tote bag that was not very popular. But you'd be surprised what women could get in their tote bags, even as small as they are. You know, like they could fit like 5 of these in there. That's why, you know, you gotta, guys, this is a lesson. But apparently it still wasn't very popular. So 300 of these smaller bags are stored in one of the company's warehouses. The amount invested in these bags is called what? Sunk cost. What's the sunk cost? Yeah, sunk cost. A cost that's sunk means that, right, Melissa, I know you're thinking, right? Whenever I ask students to write on the exam, what is a fixed cost? They write, it's a cost that's fixed. Yes. And a sunk cost is a cost that's sunk. But sunk cost means that our decision will not be impacted by this cost. So a sunk cost is a cost that's already been incurred and is not going to influence our decision. And that's what we're going to talk about the whole semester is, how do we get information to make good business decisions? So we're talking about managerial accounting. We're not looking at past performance. Remember we said we're looking at getting information so that we could make decisions about the future and try and impact the future performance of the organization. So we're interested in identifying some costs, because some costs are costs that are not going to impact our decision. So if we already spent $5 million on a piece of equipment, that should have no impact on our decision to continue producing that product line or discontinue producing that product line. And you say, well, wait a minute, what about, $5 million? Yes, but that money is spent. That money is gone. Our decision to continue or discontinue should not be impacted by that cost. Does that make sense? So we need to know what costs are sunk and what costs are not. Now that's not the case in every situation. Some costs are not sunk, and we need to take that into consideration. So for example, if we discontinue a certain product line, some of our variable costs might be reduced. So we need to understand that. So we need to know the difference between sunk costs and costs that are not sunk. Questions about that? Okay, good. All right, so let's take a look now at the schedule of cost of goods manufactured for Superior Company. So this is problem 21 in chapter 1. So remember, in class, we did a schedule like this. So this is the one that you had to do for homework. All right, so what do we start with? So we start with direct materials. Ultimately, we're trying to figure out the cost of goods manufactured. So we start with direct materials. We're also going to look at direct labor, right? And manufacturing overhead. But we start with direct materials, and we have to do some computations here. All right, some of the information is given. So what do they give us? What's next? So the raw materials, beginning inventory, they tell us, in this case, is $40,000. So we don't need to calculate that. That information is given to us. Then what? What do we do next?
Purchases.
So we add purchases. So we add raw materials purchased. So at the beginning of the period, we had $40,000 in raw materials. We purchased $290,000 worth of raw materials because we're anticipating orders from Target, Bed Bath & Beyond, Kmart, Walmart, and that tells us the raw materials that are available for use. Which is 330,000. So this is how much raw materials we have on hand to make product. We started with 40,000, we purchased 290, now we have 330,000. Now what do we do?
Deduct raw materials.
So we deduct raw materials, what?
And the end of the period.
Right, ending inventory. Which they tell us is how much?
10,000.
So if we had available for use 330,000, and then at the end of the period we had $10,000 worth of raw materials left, that means how much was used in production? $320,000. Does that make sense? This is what we started with. 40,000, we purchased 290,000. We had at that point $330,000 worth of raw materials. At the end of the period, we only had $10,000 worth of raw materials left. Now that means either one or two things. That means either the employee stole all the raw materials, which is an issue, but let's assume in this case that didn't happen, then a reasonable assumption is that $320,000 of raw materials was used in the production process. Questions? All right, so then what's next?
Direct labor.
All right, so they don't tell us what direct labor is. So let's put that down here, and we'll see how we're going to calculate that. Because remember, direct materials plus direct labor plus manufacturing overhead is going to give us what?
Total manufacturing cost.
Right, total manufacturing cost. They give us manufacturing overhead. How much is that? How much? $270,000 is manufacturing overhead. And they tell us that total manufacturing cost is how much? $683,000. So this involves a little bit of critical thinking. We calculated just now that the raw materials used in production is $320,000. That's the first component. Then what we need to do to calculate the total manufacturing cost is add direct labor and add manufacturing overhead. So we need to add this, and this, which is the raw materials, direct labor, manufacturing overhead, to get this. So what we do is we add these two together, and we get what? 590,000 plus direct labor, which we don't know, equals 683,000. So a little bit of algebra here. Don't panic. You're going to be accountants. So this is easy, right? So what do? How do we solve this? So we subtract 590 from both sides. Well, maybe you could do this intuitively, but at least let me show you how to do the calculation. This cancels out, and that means direct labor is equal to 93,000. So that was the number that they didn't tell us that we had to calculate. So now we know that this is 93,000. So if they tell us direct materials and they tell us manufacturing overhead and total manufacturing cost, then we know that total manufacturing cost is derived by adding direct materials, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. So we should be able to solve for that. And you're going to see a problem like this on the exam. So, but we're not done yet. Everybody got that? Any questions about how to calculate that? So we're all good? That'll be great. You can do it. Yes, you can. Chris, you doing all right? Fabulous. All right. So we're not done yet with our schedule, but this is a big part of the schedule. All right, so let's keep rolling. Now what do we do? Now we know that the total manufacturing costs are 683,000. Then what do we do?
Add the work in process.
Right, so we need to add the work in process from the beginning of the period, which they tell us is 42,000. So that's given. We don't need to calculate that. Question? Total manufacturing cost. So we add the work in process beginning. Why? Why do we do that? What was that?
Yeah, we were given the end, not the beginning. We had to figure out what the beginning was.
Yeah.
Oh,
But it is 42,000.
but it's 42,000.
Yes.
Okay. Right. Okay, so then we deduct the work in process beginning. No, work in process ending. Which they give us.
35,000.
Right. And we get the cost of goods manufactured. $690,000. So we have 683,000 plus X minus 35,000 equals 690,000.
I have a question for you. The 690,000, the cost of manufacturing, the cost of goods manufactured, technically it wasn't really even given to us in the problem. If you look on the side, the check figure in the book, that's where I got that number from. So if that number wasn't really given to us, would it be possible for us to find the beginning work in progress without that number?
Not in this scenario. They don't give us enough information to be able to calculate that. But it depends on the information given in the problem. But this problem, we don't have enough information to determine that.
Okay.
So we add the work in process. Who could tell us why do we, after we've calculated the total manufacturing cost at $683,000, now we're going to add the work in process beginning. Why? What's going on here? Why don't we just stop here? Total manufacturing cost. Isn't that enough? What are we missing?
You have partially completed products sitting in your warehouse that you still need to finish because you probably don't want to scrap a whole bunch of perfectly good starts, I guess. So you need to include the costs that those materials include into what you're manufacturing for this period, right?
Right. Yes, and there's a little bit more. Who could add a little bit more to that, to what Mackenzie is saying? Somebody? Anybody? We've incurred $683,000 in manufacturing costs, which includes direct materials, direct labor, manufacturing overhead. Well, what happened to those raw materials? We're assuming that all the products, all the materials that were used made finished good items. So that we use the materials to make a finished good. But this says, hey, wait a minute. We're not capturing everything here because some of the materials that we use and some of the labor that we use resulted in partially completed products. Isn't that what Mackenzie is saying? That some of the product that was produced was only partially completed. This assumes that whatever raw materials we used, that we had 100% conversion. Who was it who said before they knew what conversion costs are? Right? Over here, you guys said that conversion costs combine what? Direct labor and manufacturing overhead. But we're assuming that it's 100% conversion. But based on what we're seeing here, the information that's given in the problem, it says, well, wait a minute. We don't have 100% conversion here, because if that was the case, we wouldn't have any work in process. We wouldn't have any WIP, which is partially completed product. So it's not enough to stop here and say, okay, total manufacturing costs are $683,000. But since we don't have 100% conversion, we need to look and say, well, what about the WIP? Because ultimately what we want to get is the cost of goods manufactured. And then later we're going to calculate the cost of goods sold. Right? We're going to take this information to calculate the cost of goods sold for the income statement. So we want to know the cost of goods manufactured. Isn't WIP? We manufactured WIP. It's not a Tickle Me Elmo. It's not an iPhone. It's WIP. And sometimes we do that. That's actually not crazy. Sometimes as part of a manufacturing process, what a company does is they produce component parts. And so they might produce a significant number of component parts. Well, since it's not actually a finished good, we keep track of that as work in process. Because remember, inventory is an asset. It could be finished good, it could be work in process, it could be raw materials, So we need to understand that in order to get the total cost of goods manufactured, we need to know how much of that, or how much labor, how much direct materials, how much manufacturing overhead was used to produce the partially completed goods. And that's the point that we're at now. In order to get the cost of goods manufactured. Because we put materials into this. We put labor into this. We put manufacturing overhead into this. We don't have 100% conversion. So the way that we calculate that is we add the WIP that we had at the beginning of the period, and then we subtract the WIP that we have at the end of the period to get the net effect. So it's 683,000 plus the beginning WIP minus the ending WIP, which here they tell us is 35,000, and they also tell us that the cost of goods manufactured is $690,000.
Where you get the 6 and 9,000?
It's in the margin of the book.
Oh, that's high.
Oh, okay.
But it's not here, it's calculated.
Yeah, page 68.
Because they give you the purpose of, I know I calculated, I did it.
You got a different number other than 690?
No,
Oh, okay.
I didn't see that it was 690, so
Oh, okay.
So I calculated, like, trying to make the, income statement.
Oh, okay. So this we calculate is $42,000. $35,000 is the value of the ending WIP inventory. So some of the information is given, some of the information is not given, right? The beginning WIP in progress is not given. All right, questions so far? We're good? What was that?
How did you get the beginning with?
Okay, so this they didn't tell us.
Right.
So we had 683,000. And then to that we have to add the WIP, which we don't know. Then we subtract this, which is the ending WIP, which is given. And they tell us that after we do that, we're going to get the cost of goods manufactured is going to be 690,000. So then we solve.
Okay.
So you need to think about this in an intuitive way. All right, so let's go on to look at how do we calculate the cost of goods sold. So right now we have the cost of goods manufactured.
But they gave us the cost of goods sold. We had finished goods. Well, we needed to calculate.
Right, well we don't have, we need to go through that income statement section to calculate all the numbers. So the cost of goods sold is not the same thing as the cost of goods manufactured. Who could explain that? So we just took a lot of time to calculate the cost of goods manufactured, which is important. We need to know that. As managers for the organization, we need to know what is the cost of goods manufactured. But then, we need to know what is the cost of goods sold. Why? How is that different?
Minus inventory, which we didn't sell.
But what's the difference between the cost of goods manufactured and the cost of goods sold? Go ahead.
The cost of goods manufactured is how many units you actually produced, and the cost of goods sold is how many you actually sold to your clientele, whoever.
Right, so it's the cost that we incur to manufacture the product, whether it's actually finished good or work in process. It's the cost that we incurred, but that's not the same as what we sold. So we want to know what is the cost of the goods that we actually sold. Maybe we sold 80% of what we produced. Maybe we only sold 50% of what we produced. And sometimes that's okay to produce 100,000 units and only sell 50,000 units. Because maybe next month we're going to have a significant demand and we need to start building inventory and holding it. So there's only a certain number of units that you could make in a given period. We have a certain manufacturing capacity. So you might be excited to say, we cut that order from Walmart. We need to produce 1 million units by Monday. Maybe it takes 6 months to make 1 million units. Does that seem reasonable? I mean, what do you think? By how long do you think it takes to make any product that you could think of? I mean, it's not that you could just make products in 15 seconds. Sometimes it might take 5 hours to make a product. How long do you think it takes to make a guitar, for example? So everything takes time. So whether it's a frying pan or a teddy bear, whatever it is, it takes time to make it. And there's certain capacity limitations that any organization is going to have. Now we may need to increase our capacity. We may need to open up another manufacturing facility. We may need to hire more workers. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to say we didn't sell everything that we made. We need to have some inventory. And depending on what we're forecasting demand to be, that level of inventory can be very significant. And that could be okay. Especially if your business is seasonal and you're going into the fourth quarter of the year. You'd be very glad to have a very significant amount of inventory on hand because you know that come October or September, you're going to be getting significant orders from your retailers who are planning on selling product for the holiday season. So the cost of goods manufactured is the cost of manufacturing the product. Cost of goods sold is the cost that we incurred to make the product that we sold. All right, so let's look at that now. So finished good inventory, at the beginning of the period, we're given, right? $50,000. We add to that the cost of goods manufactured. Which is $690,000. That gives us the goods available for sale. Is what? 740,000. And then they don't tell us what this is. This is the finished goods inventory at the end of the period. And the cost of goods sold, as Melissa said, they tell us. $660,000. But this they don't tell us. So who could explain this to us? We've calculated the cost of goods manufactured. That's what this was all about, the schedule of cost of goods manufactured. Direct materials, direct labor, manufacturing overhead gives us a total manufacturing cost. And then we end up with the cost of goods manufactured. But remember that at the end of the period, we have a certain amount of sales. What we need to understand is not the cost of goods manufactured, but the cost of the goods that we sold. Because on the income statement, from sales, we subtract the cost of goods sold. And we're also going to subtract the selling, general, and administrative. But first we're going to subtract the cost of goods sold, which for many companies is very significant. That's a significant percentage of their sales. So that's something that we need to compute. So this is the way that we compute it. We look at what was the finished good inventory at the beginning of the period, and we add to that the cost of goods manufactured. Does that make sense? So up here we said, at the beginning of the period we had some partially completed goods. And we worked with that. Now when we figure out the cost of goods sold, we need to look at how much finished good inventory we had at the beginning of the period, and then how much finished good inventory we had at the end of the period. What is that going to tell us? If we know how much finished good inventory we had at the beginning of the period, and how much finished good inventory we had at the end of the period, what does that suggest to us? That's what we sold. That's the amount that we sold. But we also know that there was certain goods that were manufactured during that period. So now we have to, here they told us the cost of goods sold was $660,000, but they don't tell us what the finished good ending inventory is. But that's something that we could calculate. So how do we figure that out?
740 minus 60.
So it says the cost, the goods available for sale is $740,000. From that, we subtract the finished good inventory, and that gives us the cost of goods sold. So that means
8,000.
it's $80,000. Fun, right? So are you going to be able to do this on the exam? Because on the exam, you're going to have to do a schedule of cost of goods manufactured and this abbreviated income statement. No tricks, no games, just like this. You can do it. Yes, you can. So we did one last time. You had one for homework. You tried it on your own. So did you have any problems with the homework, or is this pretty much how you guys worked through it?
Is this still part of the schedule? I thought that was part of the income statement.
Yes, this is the schedule ends here, the cost of goods manufactured. But the reason for doing the schedule in the first place is because we need to know the cost of goods manufactured to calculate the cost of goods sold.
Okay, I just had a problem with the income statement.
Okay, so,
Because I didn't know what the sales was.
right, so for, last time we looked at one that showed sales, and then we subtracted the cost of goods sold, and then we subtracted the selling, general, and administrative. But for this problem set, they didn't have us do that. So you guys good with this, or do you want to do another one? Not another one, right? That's been good, right? All right, I'll tell you another one that you could look at. You could work through on your own, which I think you'll find helpful. I think it's the Mason company. Number 11. So chapter 1, number 11. You could try that one on your own. That's the same schedule of cost of goods. What was that? 63?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, So let's talk about job order costing, some process costing from chapter 2. So they're not the same. Who can tell us what the difference is between process costing and job order costing? Process costing and job order costing. Right, process costing is one single product, which is different from job order costing. Why? Because job order costing is a lot of different unique products. So for job order costing, you have to cost out each job separately. So what would be an example of a company that would have job order costing?
Someone who makes like wedding dresses.
Right, so every wedding dress is unique. So if you're gonna have your dress made, depending on the amount of lace that you want to have on your dress and the design and how much time it's gonna take, ultimately what the dressmaker, the seamstress, is trying to figure out is how much direct materials are gonna be used, how much time it's going to take her to make the dress, what are some of the indirect materials and indirect labor that are going to be consumed, and that's how she's going to cost out the dress. That's job order costing. So each job is going to be unique.
Professor Bassell, we have exercise 2, 3, and 4 in the cohort, which you did not put in.
2, 3, and 4
Yes.
from chapter 9? From chapter 1?
Yes.
All right, we're going to, if we have time at the end, we'll come back to that.
You never gave us something for.
So what would be another example of process costing?
A power
A power plant? All right, so explain that to us.
the only part that makes electricity.
Right? So they produce electric and what else? Anything else? All right, so process costing is making the same product over and over again, right? There's not there's not much variation, if any variation. Who can think of another example? Oscar Mayer wieners? So, yeah, so they're making hot dogs, then they're making the same product over and over again. There's nothing unique about the product from one production run to another. Does that make sense? Now, what about, let's go back and talk about job order costing again. Let's see if we can get another example there. So, a car company? All right, let's think about that.
But I don't think selling cars only.
Could be. So what do you guys think? So they're making cars, but what about the fact that they're making different model cars? Does that matter?
Piano company.
Yeah.
Does the same thing go with the hot dog? If they make, sausages or something else?
If they do what?
If they make like different type of hot dog or something? That's unique.
Right, well, I could only go with what the man told me. Right, so based on his scenario, we're assuming that he's making the Oscar Mayer wieners, and that's the nice business that we have. But if you're going to make different types of hot dogs, then the costs are going to be different, right? If you're going to have to add other ingredients. But think about how unique the product is, like with the example that we had so far with the dresses. Do you see how why that would be job order costing versus the hot dogs? Or not?
Yeah.
Because I think that's a good point of comparison. Here you're making something that's customized, that's unique. Each one is unique from the other. But here in your example, you said these hot dogs are you're just going to make 1 million hot dogs. But that's different from making a Vera Wang dress. Everybody here, is that, you want to have a Vera Wang dress for your wedding? Or no? What do you think? Except Mackenzie. Because Vera Wang, she did something very interesting. She decided that she was going to sell clothing at Kohl's. Now, Vera Wang, her couture wedding dresses sell for like $25,000 to $50,000. So I was at this wedding and somebody came up to the bride and said, "That is a beautiful dress." And the bride said, trying to be as modest as possible, said, "It's a Vera Wang." And her friend said, "I shop at Kohl's too." So that's a problem. You have to decide whether or not you're going to market your brand as a high-end couture luxury brand or something other than that. Something for the general public. You can't be all things to all people as a brand. So either you're going to sell Mercedes for $130,000 or for $30,000. Now you're probably thinking when you're out there, right fellas, and you're going down Campus Road and you're cruising for shorties. Right? I know that you're thinking that all that they know is this, right? They're not going to know the difference between the C class and the S class.
No, they know nowadays.
Yeah, they know, right?
Yeah, they smart guys.
Gold diggers. Right? They know the difference. But from a branding perspective, Caroline, I'm just keeping it real. I'm keeping it real. You can't be all things to all people. Either you're going to be a luxury brand or you're going to be a discounted or moderately priced car manufacturer. Because the people who were buying Mercedes before for $130,000, they're not going to want to buy Mercedes anymore. Just like the people who are buying Vera Wang dresses for $25,000 and $50,000. Because those were unique. Right? Those were exclusive. So when you think about job order costing, you got to think about unique, one-of-a-kind products. Like, for example, if you were going to get your house painted. If you're going to get your house painted, then, and let's say we're the painting crew, and let's just assume, for example, that I'm the manager and you guys are the painters, all right? I didn't think you were going to think that was funny, but anyway. So, and it's part of your grade instead of the final exam. Now that might not be a bad idea, right? So you're the painting crew. Every house that we paint is going to be a different job order. Each one is going to be a different quote. Some are going to be $1,800. Some of them are going to be $2,800. Some of them are going to be $10,000. Because every house that we paint is going to be different. Some are going to use more paint. Now we may use more paint because the house might be bigger. Or we might use more paint because maybe on some houses we put 1 coat of paint, but for this job they say they want 2 coats of paint. So that's going to impact the amount of materials that I'm going to use. Question? You had a question.
Okay, say there's a company that they make shirts,
one is the same color, matters differentiation, but the size. Now, is that still process costing or job order costing? Because I guess the sizes are unique in some way, shape, or form, whatever size it is.
I would say for a shirt manufacturer that it's a process costing. Because they're not unique, one-of-a-kind items. So if they were making one, that would be something else. But they're going to make 250,000 large shirts. They're going to make 185,000 medium. They can make 100,000 small. So that's a significant process that we would capture here. What we need to do then is just allocate the cost, and we're going to talk about today how do we calculate a predetermined overhead rate. But that I would say is an example of process costing. It's not one unique job. Now let's say if a shoe company?
Yeah.
Well, let's say if the shoe company or the shirt company, they got an order from, let's say, Macy's. And Macy's said, we want to buy 700,000 shirts or shoes, and we want it to be a certain color, and it's got to have their star on it, and it's got to say, we're a part of your life, and it's got to have something on there about the Thanksgiving Day parade. Then you could say that that's an example of a job order cost, right? You have to actually quote that job out for a specific company in a significant quantity. Now that's going to be very different from our regular shirt business, where we're making small, medium, and large. Here we've gone beyond that. This is a custom order. We don't know how much it's going to cost, how much material we're going to use, how much ink we're going to use for screen printing, and all these other requirements that they have.
The book gave an example for job order posting with Boeing making commercial aircraft.
Right?
Why is it considered job order if they are making the same aircraft?
All right, so
Is it because of like the parts that they use to make it?
no, because they're unique. It's a unique custom job, right? So how many of these?
But aren't there like different types of Boeings, like the 220, the 180, so on and so forth?
She knows her aircraft. But the thing is there something we need to know? But the thing is that what's different about the Boeing project that makes it unique from making shirts? Like what's the similarity between the Boeing aircrafts and the Vera Wang dresses? No, change your
Well,
mind?
because you said custom order, right? They're selling it to airlines, or they're selling it to, I mean, you know the difference between an American airline plane and a Delta plane, because they have different interior. I mean, it might be the same performance as far as the engine and the stuff that makes it work, but it doesn't look the same. So the person ordering it may want different requirements.
Right, so there's a difference between make to order and make to stock. So make to order is all these shoes and the shirts. We're making 500,000 of them, 700,000 of them, but that's a make to order business. That's different from, that's a make to stock business. That's different from make to order, which is the dress. They're not just making these dresses or these aircraft until they get the order, whether it's from American Airlines or the US government. It's one of the keys to why you would use a job order cost is that it's something that you're manufacturing for a custom order. So you're making it, it's a unique product that you're manufacturing for a particular customer. So they're going to tell you certain specifications. That's why, for example, with the Macy's Thanksgiving Day shirt. Okay, you make shirt, but because you're manufacturing it for a specific company, and because they have specific requirements that are unique, then you have to cost out the job. It's not process costing anymore, it's a job order cost. It's a specific job that you have. 700,000 shirts for the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. Now you're already making shirts, so you figure, well, I know how much that costs, but now it's different. Now they have all these different requirements, and it's got to be made out of a certain type of cotton polyester blend. And the color has got to be a certain shade of red. And you have to have screen printing on it and so forth. And maybe double stitching, which maybe before you use single stitching. So job order costing is manufactured to specific requirements or for specific customer. So it's not so much the product per se. Sure, t-shirts. In some cases that could be process costing. In other cases it could be job order costing. If you're manufacturing it for a specific customer, to specific requirements, then you're going to need to do a job order cost. Right? It's going to be job order costing. Because how would you know? Right? The whole key to process costing is that you know, through the process, you know what your costs are. You know through experience how much it costs to manufacture the product. Because you're making them, right? You're making these all day long. You know how many people that you have employed, so you know what your direct labor is. You know how much materials you're using. You know what your indirect materials are that you're using. I mean, even if they're insignificant, you know that at the end of the day, after you made 500,000 of them, you know how much thread you use. Now, thread normally would be too difficult to figure out how much thread we use for one shirt. But after you make 500,000 of them, you know that, well, we ordered this much thread from the supplier. But that's different from when you get a specific order, right? You're making a custom order. You need to cost that job out. It's not based on a process that you already have in place. What about, the book also gives the example about Disney movies. Each one is unique. There's no two that are the same. Some could take 50 weeks to produce, some could take 150 weeks to produce. Some you might have to pay, let's say you have, let's say the voice of Robin Williams. That's going to cost a certain amount of money. Or you might use a different celebrity. What about if you use Beyonce? Then it's going to be a different amount. Maybe more, maybe less. So you see the difference? So process costing and job order costing are not the same. All right, so in the job order costing system, there's a couple of documents we need to be familiar with. All right, the first is the job cost sheet. The second is the materials requisition. And the third is the employee ticket. The job cost sheet is very important. What's going to be captured on the job cost sheet? Why is that so significant?
Details of the custom
It's the details of the custom order, which are going to include direct materials. So how much direct materials are used. So for example, it's going to specify how many ounces of plastic. So for this particular job, we could call it, what are we going to call this particular job? Let's call this particular job Sky. We'll give it a code name Sky. So let's say we call this job Sky. So if the name of the job is Sky, and we use a certain amount of plastic, right? Remember, we're costing out this job now. That's what the job cost sheet is about. We're gonna, for the first item on direct materials, we're gonna list plastic. And we're gonna say 2 ounces. 2 ounces at a certain cost to us. Let's say 50 cents, 50 cents per ounce. So 2 ounces at 50 cents per ounce is gonna be $1 for plastic. If there's other direct materials, we're going to list those as well. Whatever direct materials are needed to make the product, it's going to show up on the job cost sheet. So what we're trying to figure out is, what is the cost to make Sky? That's what we're trying to make here. Right? Yes? No? All right.
It's not the total of the materials that go on the job cost sheet?
Well, how are we going to get the total for the job cost sheet? We have to know.
Materials requisition.
Well, the materials requisition is what we're going to use to get the materials from the storehouse.
Is that where we have to itemize the item?
Well, to make the items, we're going to need to, we have a certain amount of inventory. Now, we said that inventory is an asset to the company. We might have $25 million worth of plastic in storage, right, in the warehouse. There's like security guards and alarm systems, right? That's a significant asset. So when you want to get plastic from the storehouse, you have to fill out a materials requisition, documenting what it is that you're going to use, what the job is, so that we can keep track. As accountants, we need to keep track. Well, that's how we know, right? We started off with $50 million worth of plastic, and then at the end of the period, we had a certain amount of plastic left, and how much we used in production. So when we're going to start a job, we need to get materials from the storehouse. The materials requisition form is what's going to document that. How much plastic we're going to use, how many nails we're going to need, how many screws, how many gallons of glue, whatever it is. Because otherwise, what would happen? People would just be leaving with bags of nails every night, right? And we're talking about what did we say here? Just that I think this is reasonable, like raw materials purchase, $290,000. Well, if you had $290,000 worth of inventory to make product, that needs to be in a secured place. Because maybe we're a jewelry manufacturer. Maybe maybe we have 10,000 ounces of gold. I mean, just think, people leave work with pencils and pens. Just imagine if it was gold that you had lying around the office. So you need to fill out, so if you want some gold to make the earrings, you need to fill out that materials requisition form so that they know how much gold is leaving the storehouse. But the job cost sheet is going to show not just direct materials, but it's going to show direct labor as well. So it's going to show how many hours or how many minutes it's going to take to make the product. So that's going to show up on the job cost sheet. And also the manufacturing overhead. So you're gonna have each item is gonna be listed, and then you're gonna have a total. So you're gonna list all the direct materials, and then you're gonna have a summary of all the direct materials, the direct labor. Now, what do you think about that when we talk about direct labor? Why wouldn't we just say to make sky that it's just 3 hours? Why would we need to specify anything more than that? What's happening? Think about the process. So there could be more than one step in the process. So it's not just one procedure, but multiple procedures. So think about how, for example, you might make paint, for example. So if you're going to make paint, it takes a certain amount of time to mix the materials. So you're going to mix the materials. That's one part of the process. Then there might be a heating process. So you mix it, then you heat it, and then you transfer it to the next part of the process, which is the shaking part of the process, and then the canning part of the process. So those different components of the process are going to take different amounts of time. Or think about if you're making shoes. One part of the process is to cut the material to make the shoes. So to cut the leather. The next part of the process is what? Stitching. Next part of the process is punching holes in the leather. Next part of the process is polishing the leather. So all those different stages in the process are going to take time. So it's not going to be just when you say, just like you're going to line list the direct materials, the same way you're going to list different components of direct labor. Because different people at different points in the process are going to have different responsibilities. So how long does it take to punch the holes? How long does it take to polish the leather? How long does it take to stitch the leather? How long does it take to cut the leather? All of that we've got to capture. And that's going to be different. Right now we're talking about job order costing. That's going to be different for each time, for each job order. So this time it's we're going to be making sky. Next time we might be making spring. Depends. Remember, it's based on an order that we get. Questions about that? Now remember, ultimately what we want to do is track back to a particular job. So each employee has to have their own ticket. So what that's going to mean is that the employee is going to document how much time they spend making sky, how much time they spend making spring. That's what shows up on the employee ticket. So those are 3 important documents. All right, so what I want to talk about now and give you an example is the application of manufacturing overhead. So there's a difference between the manufacturing overhead that's applied and the manufacturing overhead that's incurred. So the manufacturing overhead that's applied is a number that we calculate. We need to know beforehand so that we could make decisions, what is the level of manufacturing overhead that's going to be applied to a particular product. And then at the end of the period, we're going to have to make an adjustment. Because by the end of the period, we should know what was the manufacturing overhead that was incurred. But until that happens, we'll have to make some assumptions. So let me give you an example.
It's like an estimate.
What was that?
It's like an estimate.
Right, it's an estimate, exactly. But it's not random. I'm going to show you how we calculate it based on the information that we have. So I'm going to take an example from the book. All right, let's look at problem 20. Now in their department, they have the cutting department and the finishing department. This is page 115. All right, there's certain information that they give us. They tell us, White Company has 2 departments, cutting and finishing. The company uses a job order costing system and computes a predetermined overhead rate in each department. The cutting department bases its rate on machine hours, and the finishing department bases its rate on direct labor costs. At the beginning of the year, the company made the following estimates. So they tell us what are the direct labor hours, the machine hours, the material overhead costs, and the direct labor costs for cutting and finishing departments. So what we need to do is compute the predetermined overhead rate to be used in each department. All right, so let's see how we calculate that. Why do you think there might be a difference between what we applied and what actually was incurred? So in other words, there's going to be a variance. There's going to be some type of manufacturing variance. Why would that be? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? So sometimes we're going to be over-applied, and sometimes we're going to be under-applied.
Well, it would be good in the sense that you would know, if there wasn't a variance, you would know exactly to the T what you should be able to produce. Because there's a variance, you don't exactly know, so that can be, I guess, perceived as a negative.
Well, it depends on the situation. So we might achieve some type of efficiency in the manufacturing process. So in other words, it might actually cost us, or it might actually take us less hours to produce the product than we had originally thought. Is that good or bad?
That's good.
All right, so a couple of people said bad. So if it takes us less time to produce the product than we thought, if it actually takes us 8 hours instead of 10, then that's a good thing. Then we're more efficient. And then we'll have to make some adjustment to account for that. Because let's say we said that the manufacturing overhead applied was $200,000, and then it turns out the actual is, let's say, $180,000. That's what we call a favorable variance. So it could be favorable or unfavorable. We need to make an adjustment to address that. Because like you said, at this point it's just an estimate. Once we know what the actual costs are that we incurred, we'll have to make that adjustment. Because we put on our books $200,000. That was the assumption that we made. If it turns out to be less, we have to make an adjustment. If it turns out to be more, we have to make an adjustment. All right, so in this situation, we might as well take this off too. Be able to do this on the exam, so don't worry. We get more practice. right, so we have the cutting department. So let's see how we calculate this. All right, so the predetermined overhead rate is calculated like this. We have the estimated total manufacturing overhead cost. So remember, we're trying to calculate the rate. We divide that by the estimated total amount of the allocation base. So the allocation base could be manufacturing hours, it could be the direct labor hours. We have to decide what's most relevant to our production process. So this is a general term, the allocation base. In some cases it'll be machine hours, in other cases it'll be direct labor hours. So in this case, it tells us that the cutting department bases its rate on machine hours. So what we do is we find out what is the machine hours for the cutting department. Right, 48,000. And the materials overhead. All right, so this is for the cutting department. It's $360,000. Divided by the 48,000 machine hours. Which is $7.50 per machine hour. Do you see how this is helpful? We're going to make, I'm sorry, tell us your name. Greg. Greg? Greg. Greg. So Greg said this is an estimate. So that's what we've calculated here. We take the total manufacturing overhead cost, which is $360,000. And in this case, they tell us that the machine hours, so in other words, when they operated the machine for 48,000 hours, their manufacturing overhead cost was $360,000. So remember, we're always trying to figure out, as managers, the future. As managerial accountants, what we're trying to do is use this information to make decisions about the future. That's why we're going to make this estimate. We're not focusing so much on financial accounting. We're focusing on managerial accounting. So this is very helpful to us. Why is this $7.50 per machine hour helpful to us? What kind of insight does that give us? So think about the different types of opportunities that we might have as a manufacturing organization. We have to make decisions. We're going to have to make decisions, but we can't manufacture the products first and then find out how much the manufacturing overhead is. So we have to use the information that we have and make some assumptions. So we need to decide next year, should we run the machine for 60,000 hours? Should we run it for 80,000 hours? Should we run it for 100,000 hours? What happens if we only run the machine for 40,000 hours? So in order for us to look at those different scenarios, what we need to do is we have to have some predetermined overhead rate, which is what the 750 tells us. So then any of those production quantities that I mentioned, whether it's 20,000 hours or 40,000 hours or 60,000 hours or 80,000 hours, we could multiply by the 750 per hour, per machine hour, to determine what is the total manufacturing overhead cost? Because we might have to make some decisions about which products we're going to make, which products we're not going to make, which products, in other words, what quantity we might make of product A, what quantity we might make of product B, what quantity we make of product C, or a more common decision that we're going to have to make is whether we're going to make the product or buy the product. Because people are always talking about outsourcing. We're going to buy the product from somebody else. We're going to go offshore. But we need to understand what variable costs are going to go away. Because all our costs are not going to go away. The fixed costs are fixed. Right, Melissa? Our fixed costs are fixed. So those, we're stuck with those. But if we're going to increase production, we need to understand what is the manufacturing overhead. Or if we ask somebody to make 40,000 units of the product, how much do we anticipate the manufacturing overhead cost to be? So we need to know what the cost would be so we can determine if we're going to save or not. So we got to compare what it would cost us to make the product versus how much it would cost for us to buy the product. How are we going to know unless we could have this predetermined overhead rate that tells us for 48,000 machine hours, it's $360,000. If it was 100,000 machine hours, what would be the predetermined overhead rate? Go ahead, tell us. What would it be?
148,000.
For 100,000 machine hours, what would be the predetermined overhead rate?
36.
Okay.
36?
For 48,000 machine hours, it's $360,000 in manufacturing overhead. So for 100,000 machine hours,
$3.60 per machine hour.
it's $7.50 per machine hour.
Oh, so.
Oh.
750,000.
Rough weekend on Eastern Parkway, huh? Yeah. I could tell. I could tell. I could tell. Boy, that was... Okay. So that's what I was alluding to, and I'm glad that I kind of kept pushing that point because I could tell that there was nothing going on there. The lights are on, but there's nobody home, right? That's what they say. So that's the value of getting this 750 is that we could do that type of sensitivity analysis. That's why we're saying if it's 20,000 machine hours, if it's 40,000 machine hours, if it's 60,000 machine hours, because whatever the quantity of machine hours is, we multiply that by 750 per hour. So then we could do all sorts of scenarios to see what's going to be the most profitable for the organization. So remember, we're trying to anticipate what our costs are going to be. So now let's look at the finishing department, because this is just for the cutting department. Remember, we're trying to figure out what is the predetermined overhead. This is for finishing. So we take the estimated total manufacturing overhead cost divided by the estimated total amount of the allocation base, which in this case is what? What is the allocation base for finishing? What do they use?
Direct labor.
Direct labor, right. So, in this case, the manufacturing overhead cost is 486,000, and the direct labor cost is, for finishing department, is how much? How much is it? They tell us. No?
107.
207.
Right, 270. It tells us that the direct labor cost of finishing is 270,000. So the material overhead cost is 480,000. The direct labor cost is 270,000. So that means that the predetermined overhead rate is 180% of direct labor cost. All right, so look at part 2 of the question. It says, assuming, all right, so now we're going to see how we apply the predetermined overhead rate. So they're going to say, okay, now that you computed the predetermined overhead rate, take a look at this scenario. It says that the job cost sheet for job 203 is listed below. Now they recognize there's 2 separate departments, cutting and finishing, and they tell us the direct labor hours for cutting, the machine hours, the materials requisition, and the direct labor cost. And we have that information for both cutting and finishing. So now the information that we computed, we're going to put to use. This is how we're going to calculate the overhead cost applied. Like Greg said, we're going to work with an estimate. So let's look at the cutting department. All right, so what are the machine hours for the cutting department? Remember, we're calculating the overhead applied. And that's what we're going to use to make decisions. We didn't make the products yet. We got to decide whether we're going to make these products, how many we're going to make, what are the costs associated with it. Now remember too, costs are not everything. You have to consider what impact the cost has on the efficiency of the operation. So if, let's say we're using plastic and we find out that we could get plastic at a very good price. But if the cost of the plastic is less expensive, so the direct materials cost decreases, but the direct labor cost increases, then we gotta say, well, wait a minute, does that make sense? And how much is the direct materials cost gonna decrease, and how much will the direct labor cost increase? In some cases, it may be worth it. Do you follow what I'm saying? Eastern Parkway people, wake up. Was it something that I said?
Yeah.
So we find a supplier. We find a supplier, let's say in Turkey. And the cost of plastic is going to go down by 20%. You're excited, right? Because that means you're going to get your bonus. So the price of plastic goes down 20%. But then we find out that not only are we going to have to do the cutting and the finishing, but now there's another step in the process. Because the plastic that we're getting that's 20% cheaper, when we get it, we have to process it before we could put it into our production process. Right? We have to mix it again. And that takes time and labor. Before, the plastic that we were getting from the other supplier, Once we got it in, we just put it in our machine and our process started. But now we have an extra step in the process. So we get the plastic from Turkey, it's 20% cheaper, but it adds time and labor into the process. So on the one hand, direct materials costs are going down, but direct labor costs are going up. So that's why we're going to spend the whole semester talking about this, because cost and cost behavior is what we're trying to get a handle on. And it's not always as obvious as we might think, like in this scenario. But we think, oh, the price of the materials has gone down. Of course, that seems like a good thing. But if the way we've been looking at direct materials and direct labor and manufacturing overhead, if it has a negative impact on direct labor, then we need to conduct a further evaluation. And so we need to understand what the predetermined overhead rate is. So for cutting, we have what? What are the manufacturing hours? It tells us in the book. How many hours for, how many?
Direct labor hours?
80.
80.
Right. So we have machine hours is 80. And then we computed the the predetermined overhead rate, which is what? 750. Now, we could look at producing a lot of different products. So before we make them, we're going to decide, let's say we have 10 jobs come in. We're not going to be able to produce them all. So we need to determine which is going to be the most profitable. So this could be 80 hours, it could be 100 hours, it could be 1,000 hours. And we're going to go through this calculation for each product, for each job. So this is how much? 600. So this is the overhead applied for cutting. And then for finishing is what? They tell us here that for finishing they use as their allocation-based direct labor cost, which is 150. So we multiply the 150 times the predetermined overhead rate, which is what? 180%. Which is $270. So the total manufacturing overhead applied is $870.
How do you receive 180%?
That's what we calculated by dividing the 486,000, which was the total manufacturing overhead cost for the finishing department. Right in the table above that says the materials overhead cost is 486,000 for finishing. Then we divide that by the $270,000 in direct labor costs. You see that in the middle of page 115?
Yes, I see.
Right, so that's how we, they tell us what the allocation base is. So they want to make sure that we're using the right numbers. For cutting, they tell us the allocation base is machine hours. For finishing department, they tell us that the allocation base is direct labor. So for cutting, we use the 48,000 machine hours. And we divide that into the $360,000 for materials overhead cost. And for finishing, we use the $486,000 materials overhead cost and divide that by the $270,000 direct labor cost. So both of them have as the numerator the materials overhead cost. They tell us for cutting that's 360,000, for finishing it's 480,000. All right, let's see which ones we're gonna do for homework. All right, for homework due, exercise 10 in chapter 2. And exercise,
110, right? Page 110.
right. So do exercise 1, 4, and 10.
1, 4, and 10?
Right. That shouldn't even take you an hour. And then we'll review in class, next class, I'm gonna go over with you, you don't have to do it for homework, but to read over the question beforehand, which is, problem 24 in chapter 2. Now you wanna do some journal entries? Why not? Right,
So, 3 exercises, right? That's what you said?
right.
But you also must have exercise 11 on page 63, right? Chapter 1. From the beginning.
Right, for Mason Company. Let me see what you got. Robin? Damon? Damon is here? Abigail? Oh. Okay, you're Abigail? Any other question? Dallas is here. Over. Tatiana? And Gregory is here. Irina?
Yes.
Sister was here. Alex? Elena Klemenko? Juan? Mr. Lou? Siobhan? Crystal? Elena Spanova? Kevin, I got it. Okay, go ahead, Shuma.
Do we have to close these again?
Yeah,
Do we need to write out the whole problem, or can we just do the computation?
no, just show your computation, right. Just before we go, let's take a look at exercise 14. we definitely need to know how to do the journal entries. Yes. We definitely need to know how to do the journal entries. Fun times, right? You can do it on that. All right, who's going to read the first one? Who's going to read this? The Polaris company uses a job order costing system. The following data relate to October, the first month of the company's fiscal period. All right, so who's going to read the first one? Go ahead, Mary.
Raw materials, merchant selling down from 210,000.
All right, so what's the journal entry there?
Debit raw materials and credit accounts payable.
What do you guys think?
Cash.
Well, it could be accounts payable, it could be cash. But raw materials inventory, importantly, is going to be debited because it's an asset, right? So we just spent $210,000 on raw materials. You're thinking, oh wait, that's like we're paying electric. No, this is actually a physical asset of the company. Remember, it's an inventorial cost. So the raw materials inventory is debited for $210,000. And here, Mary is right, they say it was purchased on account. So what we have to do is credit accounts payable for $210,000. All right, what about the next one? Who's going to read it?
Raw materials issued to production, 190,000. 178 direct materials and 12,000 indirect materials.
Right. All right, so it says raw materials issued to production. The total is 190,000. It says direct materials is 178,000 and indirect materials is 12,000. Now, just a little bit of a review. You know that debits have got to equal credits, right? You know that, right, Melissa? I'm just checking, just because we gotta make sure we're all on the same page here. So, what's the first thing that we're gonna debit here?
Direct material.
What was that?
Direct materials, some materials.
No, working
Work in process.
Right, Melissa says work in process for how much?
190,000.
Whoa, 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 no, not yet, that's too much.
You're doing
178,000.
8,000. Good. Okay.
What is the indirect materials?
Overhead.
Overhead.
Right, that's manufacturing overhead, so that's what we do. We debit work in process for $178,000 because they tell us that the direct materials is $178,000, and they tell us that $12,000 is in direct materials, which is code for manufacturing overhead. So we debit manufacturing overhead for $12,000, and if we debit work in process for $178,000 and manufacturing overhead for $12,000, that means that we need to credit for, what about, it can't be $178,000?
So I was thinking, but then what else? That's something different?
Then there's gotta equal credit.
Right. So it's got to be, so don't be thrown off by the fact that you have multiple entries here, multiple accounts. Work in process. Remember, we went through that whole scenario where we broke out all the direct materials, we broke out the direct labor, we looked specifically at manufacturing overhead. So when they tell us indirect materials, that's manufacturing overhead. So when we do the journal entries, that's what we need to do. We need to debit manufacturing overhead for $12,000. And then it tells us that the raw materials issued to production. That means that's the reason why we're crediting raw materials inventory, is because we filled out one of those materials requisition forms and we took raw materials out of the storehouse and put it onto the production line. Well, if we went through all the trouble to fill out that form, why? It's part of the accounting process. We're trying to keep track of how much raw materials we're purchasing, how much we're using in the production process. So if it's issued into production, That means they take the plastic, right? That's gonna become legendary this semester, plastic, right? Unless you're gonna come up with another, that's you, that's all you, right there, plastic. So that $190,000, we've gotta have a journal entry to address that. So when we credit raw materials inventory, what's happening? Is that an increase or a decrease? Raw materials inventory is decreasing. Questions? All right, the next one.
Yeah, questions. You could credit raw material 178 and we manufacture overhead we debit.
Work in process is debited 178,000. Manufacturing overhead is debited for 12,000. And then raw materials inventory is credited for 190,000. Are we good? Are we great? All right, let's go on to the next one. Who's going to read that one? Go ahead, Melissa.
Direct labor
Thanks for
costs-
volunteering.
Direct labor costs incurred 90,000, indirect labor costs incurred 110,000.
All right.
So what will you do? You will debit direct labor for 90,000 and then in manufacturing overhead or selling and administrative expenses for indirect labor.
Direct labor cost incurred is 90,000.
Which
What does it mean
will
when it says indirect labor cost?
selling and administrative or manufacturing overhead?
Manufacturing overhead.
Okay.
So indirect labor cost or indirect material cost is manufacturing overhead. So the $110,000 is manufacturing overhead, so we're going to debit that $110,000 manufacturing overhead. And then direct labor cost, we're going to, but is it going to be direct labor cost or work in process? What do you think?
Labor, right?
So it's work in process. So work in process is 90,000. We debit work in process 90,000, and then we debit manufacturing overhead 110,000, which gives us how much?
200,000.
So we have direct labor is 90,000, indirect labor is 110,000. So we have total labor cost of $200,000, and it doesn't say that we paid them.
Paid them or?
So we assume that we owe them the money, which is going to be a credit to wages or salaries payable for the 200,000. So here they give us direct labor and indirect labor. Questions? All right. D. Go ahead, Dallas.
Depreciation recorded on factory equipment, 40,000.
All right, so importantly, they tell us this is depreciation on factory equipment, not depreciation on the printer in the office or the desks in the office or equipment that's used in the sales office. This is specifically in the manufacturing facility. So that means that the $40,000 is,
Depreciation on equipment?
it's depreciation, but it's what? What is it? Is it direct material, direct labor, or manufacturing overhead?
Overhead.
So it's going to be manufacturing overhead. So we debit manufacturing overhead $40,000. And then we credit accumulated depreciation for $40,000. So it's important that we make a distinction that it's factory equipment. All right, the next one. Who's going to be the next one? Elena?
Other manufacturing Overhead costs incurred during October, 70,000 credit accounts payable. We are writing manufacturing overhead.
So what are the two accounts? We have manufacturing overhead, right? And accounts payable. So we're gonna debit, so they're telling us that the manufacturing overhead cost is $70,000. So we're gonna debit manufacturing overhead for the $70,000?
And credit accounts payable for
Right. All right, F. Who's gonna do F? Vladlena.
The company applies manufacturing overhead cost to production on basis of $8 per machine hour. A total of 30,000 machine hours were recorded in October. Manufacturing overhead would be debited for
All right, so we need to calculate what is the manufacturing overhead.
210,000.
All right, so how do we calculate the manufacturing overhead?
8
Right, so $8 per machine hour times 30,000 machine hours is $240,000. So it says the company applies manufacturing overhead costs to production on the basis of $8 per machine hour, a total of 30,000 hours. So work in process is 200, we debit work in process account $240,000 and credit manufacturing overhead $240,000. Debit work in process. Credit manufacturing overhead $240,000. Now remember, this is the next step of what we were talking about before. Remember we talked about, we said that we don't have 100% conversion. So in these examples, we're talking about the fact that we used some direct labor, we used direct materials, we used indirect materials, we used indirect labor, and the assumption is that we produced partially completed goods. That's what we're able to produce. The next one is a little bit different. It specifically tells us that we were able to convert the work in process to finished goods. So up until now, we've been debiting the work in process account, which is appropriate. But so let's see how G is different. Go ahead, Caroline? No? Okay, Siobhan.
Production orders costing $520,000 according to the job cost sheet for completed during October transferred to finished goods. Debit inventory for $520,000 and credit work in process.
So this is a good example. It's good. So they tell us that $520,000 of work in process is transferred to finished goods. So what we need to do is then, since we're moving the inventory from work in process to finished goods, that means finished goods is going to increase, work in process is going to decrease. So we're going to be tracking, that's what we're trying to do, is track the raw materials, track the inventory, the finished goods as it moves through the organization. So when it went from the storehouse to production, raw materials inventory decreased and WIP increased. So we debited WIP and we credited raw materials inventory. Now it says, okay, we're operating our manufacturing process. We have some work in process inventory that was produced. It says now we've converted it. We've converted it from partially completed and now it's finished good. Okay, so $520,000 worth of work in process became finished goods. So that means we need to debit finished goods and credit work in process. So now that we're up to G, we're almost at the end of the process. So that's why this example is very compelling, is because it takes us from the beginning, where we're actually using Siobhan's material requisition form to get that inventory, to scam them out of giving us the inventory out of the storehouse, right? So that we could put it into production. And then we could see all the steps that follow in the manufacturing process. So we converted the work in process to finished goods, and now the next step, H, is what? Who's going to read H for us? What happens at the end of the process?
So,
We, what? Yeah, we sell, so what happens? Gotta tell us.
inventory decrease.
All right, read it for us. So you want me to read it?
A production order that has cost $480,000 to complete according to their job cost sheet were shipped to customers during the month. These goods were sold on account at 25 above cost.
All right, so
We have to credit account payable $600,000.
$600,000 is right, but what we have to do is debit accounts receivable.
Yeah, debit account receivable.
So it tells us, when they tell us that the production orders, remember, this is for a job order costing system. This is for, right now we're producing what? Sky.
Yeah.
So,
Credit inventory for $480,000.
what does the $480,000 represent, that cost?
Finished goods inventory.
Right, so that's the cost of goods sold.
Yeah.
That's what they're telling us. They're telling us that for the production order, the cost is $480,000. And they say, well, we made some money, we made 25%, so our sales, you said, are $600,000, so,
$120,000.
but they didn't pay us.
Account receivable.
So the accounts receivable is $600,000, so we debit accounts receivable $600,000, and we credit sales for $600,000. But we also need to debit cost of goods sold $480,000 and credit finished goods $480,000. So we went from raw materials inventory to work in process to finished goods
Okay.
to ultimately what we did with the schedule, which was what? The cost of goods sold. So this is all what we're doing now. We did this all in the schedule. Right? This is not anything new. Don't get nervous. Don't get scared. All right? Don't get nervous. This is exactly what we did, right? All we're doing now is the journal entries for everything that we talked about in that schedule of cost of goods manufactured, and then ultimately the calculation for cost of goods sold. But having looked at it from that perspective, we need to recognize that we need to have journal entries that are addressing all those transactions. Yeah, Melissa.
So what will actually be the journal entry? We are debiting.
For which one? H?
Yeah, for H.
So for H, we debit cost of goods sold for the $480,000.
Oh, we debit because of goods sold.
And we credit finished goods for $480,000. We debit accounts receivable for $600,000 and credit sales for $600,000. So these are just the journal entries for that flow of inventory from raw materials to finished goods. Questions? It's easy, right? This is the same thing, just a slightly different perspective, right? These are just the journal entries for the schedule, basically. We went through the whole schedule. We showed how we took the cost of goods manufactured and used that to compute the cost of goods sold. These are just the related journal entries. Accountants, yes, you can do it.